Welcome to Rise Above the Line. I put this together because the context is that we have this zone that we operate in. Now, you may not feel like it's a zone. You may just feel like that's your skill level. That's where you are. But if you look back at anything you've done in sports, you play golf, tennis, weightlifting, typically we fit into these zones. The point I want to make is that this zone that we find ourselves living in is more artificial than we may think. It shows up in money habits, it shows up in fitness, it shows up in salaries. Most people have heard that somewhere around 90-95% of our lives is run by habit. I've seen the number as high as 99. I don't see 90 as often, but I have seen it. Rather than say 95% of our lives are run by habit, we can say on a day-to-day basis, we're functioning by habit 95% of the time. So when you extrapolate that, you get the 95% of our lives are run by habit. Whether you think it's 90 or 95, I don't think that matters so much. But what I want to talk about, having that as the foundation, and then from there, build on that theme. This bar right here represents 1 second, and each of these spaces is 200 milliseconds. So think 2/10 of a second. And then I'm going to draw another bar over here. This is the second. And again, broken up into 5 parts, 2/10 each. So why 2/10 of a second? 2/10 of a second is about where the conscious mind becomes aware of what's going on. But that's if you're ready for it, if you're thinking about it, you're looking for it. Some of you ride bicycles on the road a lot. You probably have this habit of covering your brake as you approach an intersection, for example. So you're ready for it. So if somebody comes out, that's when you can get the 2/10 of a second. But if you're thinking about other things, it could be 7/10 of a second. And this is the conscious, again, it's the conscious mind. If you're talking on the phone and you're completely distracted, it's somewhere over here. This is why they say if you're talking on the phone, on a cell phone, even if it's hands-free, that your reaction time mirrors that somebody who's alcohol impaired. And it's because you're distracted. So it takes a while for your conscious mind to catch up. This is 95% habit. Then the next part, the unconscious, and you'll notice I don't call it an unconscious mind. I don't call it a subconscious mind. You listen to all my podcasts, you will not hear me call it a mind because I don't give it that much credit. It's a series of associations, and those associations are from the past, largely from the past. I say largely because you can visualize things in the future and create neural pathways in the future. And that's a useful practice, especially like with implementation intentions. And by putting more and more emotion into it, this is why they say the unconscious doesn't know the difference between real or imagined, because you can build neural pathways. These are fascinating developments. And the reason it's so important now, and the reason I'm doing this, the podcast, Life Expansion After 50, is because for us over 50, we sort of missed out on that. We were taught a wrong model about 50 years ago, oddly enough. This is when epigenetics started showing up. And then about 40 years ago, neuroscience started catching up. About 20 years ago, the measurement tools became so powerful that they could actually see what's going on. And that's how they realized that the unconscious is actually 100 billion neurons. So each of those neurons interact with anywhere from 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. So that's a lot of connections. These are your neural pathways. And then there's a neurotransmitter between each neuron that gets the connection going. So we got 95% of our lives are run by habit. Those habits live in the unconscious, and the unconscious, essentially 100 billion neurons. Now, part of the big challenge is it's been called an unconscious mind for so long. So in all the books, unconscious mind, and all over the internet, it's unconscious mind, subconscious mind, unconscious mind. The mind is extremely powerful. The mind is very, very powerful. It creates, it can imagine, it can do all these things. The mind, you can actually access from a quantum physics standpoint, what we call the infinite field of possibility. The unconscious can't do that because the unconscious cannot imagine possibilities. It's only running past experiences, past associations. And as I said, some of those associations can come from visualization because you build a neural pathway. Deep practice actually builds up the neuron. It wraps myelin around it, which makes it fire faster, stronger, with more accuracy. So it's very difficult to break a habit. I use the example of a steel beam. Trying to cut a steel beam with a nail file, that's like trying to get rid of a habit that the neural pathway is wrapped well with myelin. But when you layer on a new habit, you're creating a new neural pathway. And what does change very easily is the synapses, the neurotransmitter in between neurons. So by layering on a new habit, you literally neutralize the old neural pathway because the transmitter, the neurotransmitter moves from that neural pathway over to the new one. And that's very close to scientifically sound saying it. I mean, neuroscientists can take me to task and exactly how I'm using the words, but like I said, I've studied with these guys. And so I was able to ask them these questions, and you can go and do your own research and you'll see that this is what shows up. So it's 100 billion neurons was the game changer for me. So we got 95% of our lives is run by habit. Now we have, this is the big one, the unconscious. The unconscious can process at 11 million bits per second. 11 million bits per second. That's what the unconscious processes at. The conscious mind processes at a measly 50 bits per second. So in other words, the conscious mind doesn't stand a chance. This is why we say the unconscious has the tactical advantage over the conscious mind. This is why habits win out all the time. This is why habits are better than willpower. This is why imagination is better than willpower. This is why you just can't do it with willpower. There's just too much going on. So that brings me, if you accept these three things, it makes the rest of this session a lot easier to accept. If you don't accept these three things, I suggest you withhold judgment, take the rest of it with an open mind. Later on, go do your research. You can look at, just start Googling it, but a big source of this information is Bruce Lipton. You can look at his YouTube videos. He's been talking about this since the 70s, and he's a doctor who was studying cells and genes. But it's been a real challenge because I said to adopt what he's talking about, universities would have to change programs, books would have to be rewritten. The whole process, pharmaceuticals, everything gets affected when you say that it's not a mind at all. It's a bunch of neurons. There's 100 billion neurons. If a person dies, their mind, they're laying on the planet Earth, their mind is gone, their spirit is gone. There may be remnants of some energy, but what's on Earth is their brain and the nervous system. So see, this is matter. Neurons are matter. They're not energy. Energy goes through them, but neurons are matter. So it's a game changer because by calling it a mind, we put this into what I call a sacred space where you don't mess around with that. But advertisers mess around with it all the time because they're creating associations, and that's what advertising is. It's tapping into our click words, tapping into our normal habit patterns. So anyway, so 50 bits per second, that's where this comes into play now. So we got the first second and we have the second second. And the second second, the reason I put that there is because if you accept that the unconscious and the brain, that's the unconscious and the brain, so I'll add that over here, the brain and the unconscious. And by the way, the 100 billion neurons, 86 billion of them are in the brain, and the other 14 billion or so are throughout the body and the nervous system. And this is why when you have anxiety or emotional distress, you can actually locate it somewhere in your body because a lot of times it's stored in those neural pathways, not in the brain, but in the body. All right, so that's the brain and unconscious process, 11 million bits per second. And it's instantaneous. 0.2 of a second, the earliest time that the conscious mind is starting to pick up what's going on, the unconscious potentially has already processed 2 million bits of information. 2 million bits before the conscious has even had a chance. And if you're distracted or you're unclear about what's going on, you're trying to figure out this just doesn't make sense, especially if you're used to functioning on habit. The conscious mind is not practiced in engaging quickly. You could end up somewhere in here. So potentially 4-6 million bits of information can be processed. This is why cognitive biases happen. This is why we get sucked into buying things that we didn't mean to buy. It's why our habits are what they are. And this is why our lives are mostly run by habit, in my opinion, because within 2 to 4 tenths of a second, the unconscious has processed 2 to 4 million bits of information and is already making decisions. It's already kicking off neural pathways. Remember, neurons interact with 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons. That's a lot of interacting going on that creates this problem. And the reason I have the second second in here is because now in the second second, we're starting to look for the solution or the reaction. What are you going to do about it? Now, in the case of fight, flight, freeze, or faint, the unconscious has probably already taken charge. It's already kicked off the adrenaline, everything's going on. And so that decision has already largely been made. And by the time the conscious mind catches up, it's already down that path. It's doing what it has to do. It's interesting when you start watching this, you can actually see it play out in how people approach their lives. This gets into problem solving because the first step of problem solving is clearly define the problem. Now, Einstein is quoted as saying if he had 1 hour to solve a problem, he would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. Clearly defining the problem is the objective for that. That doesn't mean you're always going to use 80% of the time to think about the problem, but it paints the picture that we do need to spend some time there. So this brings me to above the line. So I've got this line. Under the line is our comfort zone. So we have our comfort zone here, and there's levels. See, for many of us, we might think that this top part is above our line because we're uncomfortable there. And what I'm doing is I'm drawing this zone that we operate in. And, in this zone, and then we start working on meditating, mindfulness, and some things like that. And we raise the floor. We don't go down as low. I like talking about this like anxiety because most business people have experienced what I call business anxiety. I'm not talking about mental health. I'm talking about the business anxiety that happens when you get notified of some piece of bad news and you're already tired or stressed and the anxiety starts to kick in. You have too many days like that in a row and you could actually start feeling like, man, I'm on my way to depression. That doesn't happen very often for business owners because you figure out that you can't live like that. The point is, when you think about it from an anxiety standpoint, people don't want to have anxiety. That's the line that they want to cross. It's very hard to have gratitude or be grateful or acknowledge that, you know what, I did better. I had less anxiety, or I experienced anxiety less last week, or my anxiety had a shorter duration last week, or my anxiety was less intense last week. So that's progress, but yet you still don't break the line. So then you're coming down again, but you continue with the practices. And there's more than mindfulness and meditation. I'm using that as a catch-all phrase, but there's a lot more. A lot of it has to do with learning how to put a pause between the unconscious becoming aware of something and the conscious mind becoming aware of it. So then we raise the floor a little bit higher, but we still don't break the line. And this is where people start to get frustrated and even give up, because they're saying, you know what, I've done this work. I've been working on this thing. It hasn't happened. What's going on? And they give up. It happens with fitness. It happens with weight loss, but you're literally improving. You're raising the floor first. You're building up almost like a spring, some tension. And a lot of times people will never break through the line because they stop. What I hate to see happen is that the person gives up and they go right back down. They just spiral down. We don't want that to happen. What we want to see happen is that you rise above the line. That's what we want to see. Now, the challenge is from here, looking at this, it's just a line. It's an artificial ceiling. It's like rope around the adult elephant's foot that keeps them from moving, because when they were a baby elephant, there was a chain and a metal post. So the conditioning sunk in deeply enough that if you put a rope around an elephant's foot tied to a wooden peg 6 inches in the ground, it's not going to move because it's just conditioned. But this line is not just a line. And this is the unfortunate thing. This line is a barrier. And that barrier has stories, habits, beliefs, phobias, so many associations. I can go on and on. Friend groups, education, voices, the voices in the head. We have voices from our parents, voices from teachers. We have voices from friends, voices from relatives. So many people who are not trained to help us develop. By the way, one of the things I didn't mention on that prior page, the unconscious is largely conditioned from 0 to 7, because as a child, we just download essentially what we need. Think about it from a hunter-gatherer standpoint. The purpose of the system, and I'll call it the system. So think about it like a computer. The system is the operating system. Unconscious is the program. So you take a computer without anything on there, it's just the operating system. Then you put in Microsoft and now you can use different applications. So that's the program that happens from 0 to 7. But the system, the purpose of it is to make sure we live long enough to procreate. So it stands to reason that your parents were alive long enough to have you. So therefore they must know something about surviving long enough to procreate. So we're just going to have the system download between 0 and 7 everything this person needs to know to get along in a tribe, a hunter-gatherer environment. Don't piss off the chief because it can kill you. Maybe that's where the fear of public speaking came from. Don't speak up in front of the chief. Why the unfamiliar is so scary to the unconscious. Where you normally hunt, you understand where the animals are, you understand the issues, what to eat, what not to eat. But when you get into an unfamiliar territory, you don't know. So the unconscious is programmed to avoid the unfamiliar. But that conditioning that happens from 0 to 7 is the source of many of our issues as we get older, especially, I mean, at 50 years old, the world is very different than it was 43 years ago. So you're operating on a program that is not optimized for where we are today. The reason I stopped there on voices, and I can keep listing more, but voices in our head, that's a big one. Once you get into this barrier, you have a choice because it's going to be painful, mentally painful, because everything is going against what you believe. And we're going to run into this thing called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance, and that's going to make us brain fog, things like that. And it makes us focus on what's wrong. Why do I not feel so good? What's wrong with me? I'm nervous, and it makes you focus on the negative. And by the way, if you don't do inner work, the majority of your thoughts tend to be negative. Advertising does that. Our system is already set up to focus on the negative. So you have a lot of that happening. So now we're going up here, more cognitive dissonance, more challenges, more concern. One of the things that's happening is you're getting the neuroplasticity. Remember I mentioned that the neurotransmitter fluid in between the neurons, it self-eliminates to go provide the transmission for the new habit, the new neural pathway. That neuroplasticity happens when we're sleeping. So you need to get rest. And this is why a lot of times you go to bed with this feeling like nothing's going to work. That's not happening. And you wake up with a positive outlook on things. And in fact, sometimes you have answers. It's because your the neuroplasticity is creating new neural pathways. There's something else that's going on. One of them is you can't have a breakthrough without a break with your past thinking. People say level of thinking that got you into a problem is inadequate to get you out of the problem. Any breakthrough is going to be preceded by something that you can relate to brain fog or confusion. You can't have a breakthrough without letting go of past beliefs. That letting go of past beliefs is not easy, and it shows up as cognitive dissonance. So this barrier, it's about 3 to 6 months because you're doing a lot of change. And because you have 100 billion neurons interacting with 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons, there's a lot of neural pathways that keep getting triggered. Like you can walk into something or hear something and it reminds you of something that happened 20 years ago. These neural pathways are all there. If you do for consultants, it's interesting, you can have a conversation with somebody and all these things that you've learned 10, 20, 30 years ago, they just come up because they're in the neural pathways and they get triggered. And you learn to trust it. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Blink, he talked about thin slicing. I don't recall him making the connection here, but I see the connection as that thin slicing is what's happening at the unconscious level. That 0.2 of a second before the conscious mind even knew. He used the example of a fake painting, and experts were able to pick up it was fake, but they couldn't tell you why. And it's something in that unconscious processing, that first 0.2 of a second, 2 million bits, it picks it up, and the conscious mind can't even tell you why. So we keep going, and when we finally break through that line, it never goes a straight line. It's going to constantly be, ebb and flow, give and take, because we have to keep growing. But once we get above the line, we're through all of these stories. You still have some cognitive dissonance. You'll still have some opportunities there. But you flipped a lot of this. The other thing that happens is the whole system is worrying about your survival. And that's why it's stopping. It's not stopping you because it doesn't want you to be successful. The stories, the habits, the beliefs, the phobias, the associations, balancing to your friend group, because it doesn't want you to be lonely. All of that was designed to keep you safe. Well, doesn't it make sense that that same system, once you're above the line, it's still going to want you to survive? It's just not doing it with the past associations. And so here's my argument. Once you get above the line, because the unconscious doesn't have as many memories, as many associations, as many neural pathways from the past, it's actually easier above the line to put that pause between your conscious and the unconscious. So I've covered a lot here. But I wanted you to see this from a business standpoint, because if you look back at your business career, if you look back at jobs you've changed, when people ask you the question, what would you do if you knew you couldn't fail? That's up here. And what's in between you and that, and here's your purpose. Up here is we have our self-actualization. We have that life we want to design. It's all up here. And so to get there, you have to break through that barrier. I'm going to leave it there because this topic is so large and you have to take it in bite-sized chunks. And I'm going to go back to what I said on this earlier page, that you don't accept the 95% by habit or the 11 million bits per second or the 50 bits per second, or that it's 100 billion neurons. If you don't accept those things, this would be much harder because you'll continue to think of the unconscious as the mind, and it's not a mind, it's associations. The mind, the conscious mind, can actually control the unconscious through things like mindfulness and visualization and implementation intentions and mental contrasting, the powerful present moment, these different models that we have, and keeping a growth mindset, neutralizing triggers, neutralizing cognitive biases, turning automaticity to work for you instead of against you. There's so many different directions we can go, which is why it takes the 3 to 6 months. But I also say it's very prescriptive.